إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا وحبيبنا مولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله. قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فبما رحمة من الله لنت لهم ولو كنت فظا غليظ القلب لانفضوا من حولك فاعف عنهم واستغفر لهم وشاورهم في الأمر فإذا عزمت فتوكل على الله إن الله يحب المتوكلين. صدق الله العظيم. فقال النبي الكريم صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم إن شئتم أنبأتكم عن الإمارة وما هي أولها ملامة وثانيها ندامة وثالثها عذاب يوم القيامة إلا من عدل أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. أما بعد. One of the most interesting aspects of the times that we live in is the manifestation of what the Prophet ﷺ told us would occur, which is that in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the best of people were in positions of leadership. And what he told us is that a time would come when the worst of people would be in positions of leadership. And today what we see is that most people in positions of leadership, they have a distinct lack of the ability to lead. And it's leadership as it relates to generally, but of course for us, the lens we see it through is the lens of the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And there's no one particularly here that I'm speaking of, but in general what we see, whether it's society, whether it's communities, whether it's families, there is a lack of leadership that exists. And the people today who are in positions of leadership, more often than not, do not truly exemplify the qualities of leadership that human beings innately understand to be righteous. That they innately understand to be righteous. And we see what the results of that are, which is that people today are more divided than ever, which includes our ummah as a whole. People today are more divided than ever because a good leader unites people. People today are more in despair than they've ever been, causing harm to themselves, doing things even beyond that. People are in more despair than they've ever been because a good leader inspires. And people today are more angry than ever because a good leader takes accountability, which cools the anger of those who are upset. These three characteristics, division, despair, anger, these three characteristics are all things that a good leader prevents from occurring. And we see this in our times today, that all of these things exist because as a whole, again, whether it's from a cultural perspective, whether it's from a community perspective, from a state's perspective, from a country perspective, the lack of leadership is clear. And in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, what we do see is that his example of leadership was one that everyone followed behind. Everybody followed behind the Prophet ﷺ. And it was a type of leadership that protected people from all of these types of things. When it came to uniting people, the Prophet ﷺ is, I would say inarguably, the most successful human being ever at doing the job of uniting people. Because he united people not just from around the Arabian Peninsula, which in and of itself was an extremely difficult task, but he united people from all over the world. Persians, Romans, Abyssinians. And today what we see is an Islam that is all across the world. There is no place that the light of Islam has not touched. And so what we see is that the Prophet ﷺ, his leadership was such that it united even after his life. You know, think about the fact that after his life, the 6 major collections of hadith that we look at today, how many of them come from Arabs? How many of them come from Arabs? It would shock you if you really took a second and thought about it to realize that when it comes to Sahih al-Bukhari and Imam Bukhari, rahimahullah, he's from Uzbekistan, modern day Uzbekistan. Imam Tirmidhi, modern day Uzbekistan. Imam Muslim, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, all of them are not Arab, they're Persian. They were Persian from Khorasan. And Imam Nasa'i is from what we call modern day Turkmenistan. Ma wara an-nahr, as they said. So what do you see here? That the Prophet ﷺ's leadership was so strong, so powerful, the ability to unite was so strong that even after his life, we see the examples of it echoing in our lives today. What you read in the hadith books was collected not by the people who were directly around the Prophet ﷺ, but by people who lived and their ancestors lived miles and miles, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles in some cases away. The Prophet ﷺ did it because he was constantly focused on uniting his companions, uniting his ummah, bringing them together, rather than pointing out differences. Oh, this person does that. Don't you know this guy does that? Don't you know that she's this part of this or that, or she's from this area, or he's from this? None of that was relevant. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about this in Surah Ali Imran, where He tells us, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. First, the very obvious command, hold fast to this rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and don't separate. Don't divide one another. Don't go away from each other. وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً. Remember the favor of Allah on you when you used to be enemies. Now this verse specifically is referring to the Aws and the Khazraj. Now, if you want to understand how bad the Ansar were in terms of the fighting that they had, the anger and the enmity and the battles, the problems that they had before the Prophet ﷺ came. That Allah says, إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً, you were enemies. فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. If you want to understand how bad it was, if you want a modern day parable, a modern day example, India versus Pakistan. That's how bad it was. You'll never find an Indian person speaking highly of Pakistan or well of Pakistan. You'll never find a Pakistani man or woman speaking highly of India. And all of that is irrelevant and nonsense as it relates to being a Muslim. But the key point is that Islam took people who were that divided. The Prophet ﷺ came to people who were that divided and he brought them together. فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put into their hearts the desire to come together. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا. And by His grace, by His mercy, through what He put into their hearts and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, He united them. He made them into brothers. وَكُنْتُمْ عَلَى شَفَا حُفْرَةٍ مِّنَ النَّارِ. You were on the edge of a pit of fire because you thought your ethnic background, you thought your people were more important. But a leader came to you to unite you by the mercy of Allah, and He brought your hearts together and showed you you are not this or that, you are brothers. And by doing so, He saved you from being on the edge of a pit of fire. فَأَنْقَذَكُم مِّنْهَا. He saved you from the pit of that fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did. كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ آيَاتِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَهْتَدُونَ. This is how Allah shows you His signs. The people today who were as divided as anything, as any example you could find, He brought their hearts together. Because this is what a good leader does. This is what individuals who are strong, powerful, righteous leaders do. They do not divide, they unite people. And so when you understand this, nothing would have given you an indication that the Aws and Khazraj could come together, but the Prophet ﷺ did that. But that's not all the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with. Because one aspect is uniting. But another I talked about was the idea of despair. What brings despair is when the odds seem to be against you. When things seem to be completely against you. It's not in your favor. It's clearly going to be something difficult for you. This causes people to despair when they have no hope. And I want you to think about what the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with, because on its face, the odds that the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with, they wouldn't have made sense. If I was to ask you, if I was to come to you, or someone was to come to you and say, would you prefer an army if you were playing a game, whatever these things are, where they have like fake armies or different cities and countries. If you were given an army, would you take the army that had 300 people or 1,000 people? Every person would say 1,000. Because why? You have more numbers. You have better odds, right? If somebody came to you and said, if you had a choice between 700 and 3,200, which would you prefer? Which army size would you prefer? Okay, great. Now that you've definitely chosen 3,200 because that is the obvious answer, how about 3,000 soldiers versus 10,000? How about 3,000 versus 10,000? Again, same answer. Of course, 10,000. You would always take the army, the group with more people, with more soldiers. Because when you're at a constant 3-to-1 disadvantage, the math tells you that you're not likely to be successful. If you're playing soccer and you have one group has 11 men and the other has 3 or 4, which one would you take? Who would you say is going to be victorious? Obviously, you'd look at it from the lens of, well, there's more people, more opportunities, more things that can happen. And yet, in spite of the fact that those were the numbers that the Prophet ﷺ had, he had 300 in Badr, he had 700 in Uhud, and he had 3,000 in Khandaq, against, respectively, 1,000, 3,200, and 10,000. He was constantly at a 3-to-1 disadvantage. And what was his record? What was the record in those battles? Badr was a humiliation for the Quraysh. Absolute annihilation for them, in spite of the fact they had a 3-to-1 advantage. Uhud, at the very beginning, was very clearly a victory for the believers, until a time came where some believers disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ. They didn't listen to what he had to say, and that turned it into something worse. But at the very beginning, it was very clear that this was going to be another good day, even in spite of the fact that they were at a 3-to-1 disadvantage. And then Khandaq. To be sitting in a city and to have 10,000 people camped outside of your city limits, ready to kill you, ready to take the life of every single man, woman, and child, your family, your daughter, your son. And in spite of being at those odds, what did the companions say in every battle? Did they say, Ya Rasulullah, I don't know, seems a bit tough. Should we do this? Or did they say, كم من فئة قليلة غلبت فئة كثيرة? How many small groups have beaten larger groups by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because the Prophet ﷺ inspired them. The Prophet ﷺ pushed them. He taught them to go beyond the limits that they even knew that they had. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help was there. To go beyond their limits and to trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what a good leader can do, that he inspires his people. He doesn't just say to them, yeah, you can do it, it's okay. No, but he proves it, not just through his words, but through his example. And in each of those battles, the Prophet ﷺ was right out there as well with his companions. The Prophet ﷺ was not sitting in the back in a tent saying, you know what, why don't we send them there and send them. The Prophet ﷺ was right there in the battle with his companions. A good leader inspires people. And he earns their respect. He doesn't simply say that, you know what, I'm your leader, so do what you're supposed to do. He earns their respect, inspires them to do more, and teaches them to do it better than they've ever done. This is what good, true, sincere leadership is. And lastly, accountability. Because that anger that comes, most people today are angry because of a lack of accountability. You know, subhanAllah, I can't tell you how many times I hear people come and say, you know, what are these leaders doing? The Saudis are doing this, or this country's doing, the Qataris are doing this. Always something. Always something. These people are doing this. These people are doing that. First and foremost, what about ourselves? We're constantly looking at other people, hoping to criticize them. What about ourselves? What are we doing? Yes, you may not be in a position of leadership. You may not be leading a country, but you have leadership somewhere. You have the ability to affect change somewhere. So the first thing is stop looking around the world to try and figure out what's this person doing wrong, what are they doing wrong, so you can feel better about your lack of action. But instead, look at what you can do better. How you can make change in your own circle, in your own environment, in your own place. See what difference you can make. And secondly, these people are most often angry because they see what these leaders do and they become upset because there's no accountability. It's my way or the highway. Do this because I said so. There's no conversation behind it. There's no justification, no understanding behind it. And so people become frustrated. People become upset. The Prophet ﷺ, out of respect, we don't say the Prophet ﷺ made mistakes. We don't say Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam made a mistake or did this and did that. What we recognize is what he said to us. There's an example in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. And in this time, the Prophet ﷺ, when some of his Ansari companions who were farmers, they had a habit of using a certain germination technique, fertilization technique. And when the Prophet ﷺ happened to see them doing it, he questioned what this was. And he just made a comment, something along the lines of, maybe it'd be better if you didn't do it. Maybe if you tried without doing it, you'd have better results. Just a comment, a passing comment. But the companions were such, when they heard the words of the Prophet ﷺ, they didn't simply just say, oh, okay, cool, he said it, let me just do whatever. No, they listened to what he had to say. And so they listened to him. And they did what he said. And then their crop, when it came back not as strong, in the next harvest, they went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, Ya Rasul, we did what you said, but it wasn't good harvest. We don't understand. Think about in your own context. Ask yourself what would happen if someone you see as a leader in your life, who is a leader, ask yourself if it's your parent, your boss, your teachers, whoever it might be. If you came to them and said that the thing that you said was wrong, or it didn't work out the way you said it would, how would they respond? Most people, being honest, most people, the way they're going to respond is, you must have done something wrong. You didn't do this correctly. You're the one at fault. They would pass the blame to you and say, no, it must have been something on you because I can't be wrong. What did the Prophet ﷺ do? They came to him and said, Ya Rasulullah, it didn't happen the way we thought it was going to be better. The Prophet ﷺ said, listen, you know your affairs. You're the experts in your fields as it relates to whatever worldly matters you have. I was just making a comment. You trust what you have as it relates to your worldly affairs. Follow that. When it comes to your deen, however, that is where you need to look to me. That's where Allah has put me in this position. So what is the Prophet ﷺ acknowledging? That they know better as it relates to their affairs, the things that they have expertise in. And it's not the deen. The deen is the one thing amongst others that the Prophet ﷺ had absolute expertise in. No one could argue after the Prophet ﷺ said something because this is what Allah wanted. So the Prophet ﷺ said, you know your affairs. You do them. He took accountability. And accountability, we talked about this week in the Khatira, is not just one type. It's not just, oh, I did this or I said this or I made this mistake and you own it. But it's also facing your problems, not running away from them. Not simply saying, oh, you know what, it's too difficult and I don't want to deal with this right now, putting it into a box to just walk past. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't do this either. Because that's another thing you would see people today do. Someone comes and they know someone comes to you and, or rather you go to that person and you say, hey, this didn't happen the way you said it would. Either they're going to make excuses or they're going to avoid you. They're not going to want to face you. They're not going to want to talk to you. Because then they might have to actually take accountability to face their problem. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't run from that kind of accountability. Leaders, when they take accountability, brothers and sisters, it calms people. It takes away their anger. Think about in your own life, someone makes a mistake, your son or your daughter, your coworker, your friend, they make a mistake. If they start saying, but I thought, there was this reason or that reason or this, you're going to get more and more upset. But if they say to you, you know what, I'm so sorry, I made an honest mistake, please, please forgive me. It cools the anger. It calms that flare up that comes in the mind. Because accountability, this is what it can do, brothers and sisters. It opens your heart. It makes you feel like, you know what? It's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. Because that's the truth. But if someone's not willing to acknowledge it, if they're just going to make excuses, if they're just going to avoid you, you're never going to feel content. You're always going to feel angry, and it's going to build on top of more anger and more anger and more anger. And that's what we see today. People constantly saying, oh, what about this person or that or this? Just angry. because no one's taking accountability. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts to the right path. Allow us to be people who are good leaders. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. I'm going to ask everyone to scoot up, please. Fill in the gaps. Fill in this front row as well. I do want to clarify once again. This khutbah is not about any person, place, community, masjid, anything. This khutbah is a general idea. It's a general conversation for us to have about what leadership through the lens of the Sunnah looks like. And if we want to be able to be people who are following the Sunnah in all aspects of our lives, we need to also look at it as it relates to leadership, because every single one of us is in some position of leadership. You can't escape it. It may not be something that you recognize. You may think to yourself, no, I don't have that. I'm not a supervisor. But you are perhaps an older brother. You are perhaps an older sister, which puts you in a position of leadership. You are perhaps a mother or a father, which puts you in a position of leadership. You are perhaps in your job someone who's more senior than other people. Everybody has at some capacity, some level of leadership in their lives. And what I want to conclude with is 3 reminders for us to take. The first is to be in a position of leadership is a trust, an amana, not a privilege. This isn't this type of today it's like popularity contest. Who's going to vote for me? Who's going to do this and do that? And I'm going to be the best and I'm going to get all these perks. It's not what leadership is. It's not something to seek out either. To go to people and say, yes, give me this power. I want this power. The Prophet ﷺ told us what leadership is. أَوَّلُهَا مَلَامَةٌ. The first part of leadership, what is it? Being blameworthy. What about the second part of leadership? وَثَانِيُهَا nadama, regret. The first part is to be blameworthy, because you will always be blameworthy as a leader. Someone will be upset. The second is to have regret, because when you make decisions, you will always regret something. You won't always make the right call. And then the Prophet ﷺ, وَثَالِثُهَا عَذَابٌ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. And the last part is punishment on the Day of Judgment. But then he makes an exception. إِلَّا مَنْ عَدَلْ. Except for someone who is just. Just doesn't only mean that you're righteous. Somebody comes to you and says, oh, this happened to me, and you give them their rights. Just means that you give it its haqq. That if you are in a position of leadership, you give it the time that it demands of you. That if you're in a position of leadership, you speak to people in a way that makes them feel comfortable speaking to you. That you don't set yourself up to be blamed by people. You don't set yourself up to constantly have regrets. And most importantly, you don't set yourself up to have punishment because of your lack of justness. Your lack of ability to be just. Number 2, often the idea that we have is that the strongest, toughest person, the harsh man, the one who's tough with people, that this is the best leader. But is that what the Prophet ﷺ teaches us? Because your culture may tell you one thing. The society you live in may tell you one thing. But when the Prophet ﷺ tells you something different, that's what you listen to. And what Allah tells us is, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. By Allah's mercy, you were soft with them. وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. If you had been harsh and hard-hearted, they would have dispersed from you. They would have run away from you. They would have just abandoned you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ. So, forgive them. Ask for their forgiveness. Seek forgiveness for them. فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ. Ask Allah for forgiveness for them. وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. And keep them engaged. Keep them involved. Don't just say, oh, you don't decide and I make the decisions. A good leader does shura. Asks people for their advice. This is what we have to recognize. Do you think because you're a tough guy, people will be inspired? No. Because the Prophet ﷺ inspired far more people against far bigger odds, not by being a tough guy, quote unquote, but by being someone who was kind, who was gentle, who was merciful, who was honest, who was sincere. These were the qualities that made the Prophet ﷺ who he was. And lastly, whatever role of leadership you have in your life, mother, father, brother, teacher, whatever it might be, give that position its haqq. If you are an older brother, don't you dare look at your younger siblings and say, I'm not speaking to you because you did this or did that. Your objective, your responsibility as an older sibling is to forgive. Your responsibility is to say, you made a mistake and you are younger than me. I, because I'm in a position of leadership, have to do better, have to be better. Don't just walk away from it because, oh, I felt bad. Too bad. Because the hallmark of leadership is that you have to do things that you don't want to do. Every leader needs to make decisions that they don't want to make, but they have to. And if you think to yourself that, oh, I can make this decision because I feel better about it, and you're ignoring what Allah tells us, don't break family ties. You're ignoring what the Prophet ﷺ taught us, don't break these family ties, and you think you're right, I promise you on the Day of Judgment you will not be right. Promise you that. If you're a mother, if you're a father, brother, sister, whatever role you have, a boss up in your position, if you're a CEO, an executive, whatever role you have, you are in a position of leadership, and know that you will answer. Leadership is not something to be sought out because it can only bring you blameworthiness and regret on the Day of Judgment, and potentially it can bring you adhab, punishment. But the adhab only comes if you're not just. So give it its justice. Give it its time. Give it the rights that it deserves. And don't simply say, oh, I'm in this position and I'm so cool and I'm so high and I'm so righteous. And so now I get to be this great person in front of everybody. Because I promise, once again, I promise, when Allah holds us accountable on that day, He will not be saying that what you did was cool or right or great. He'll be asking you why you didn't put in the time you were supposed to. Why you didn't forgive as you should have. Why you didn't do more than you did. And that's not a position to be in. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us all to be good, righteous leaders. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be individuals who come together rather than are divided. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless our community and allow us to be ones whose hearts are united. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma barik ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad kama barakta ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون. اذكروا الله العظيم يذكركم واشكروا يزدكم واستغفروا يغفر لكم واتقوا يجعل لكم من أمركم مخرجا وقيموا الصلاة.